Well, good afternoon, good morning and good evening to everyone from around the world. I'm Rohit Talwar from Fast Future, moderating this event, and we have four fantastic panelists with us. John, could we get, David, could we get the first slide up?
Yep, sure. Just hold on a second. I will load the first slide.
This is the first in a series of seminars that we're going to be doing pretty much every week around this theme of aftershocks and opportunities. And the first one that we're doing today is looking at global perspectives on the world after COVID-19. As I say, we have Peru's Chowdhury, Tanya Hichert, Pero Mičić, and Jerome Glenn as our participants. And you have the opportunity to join in the conversation. You can raise questions in the Q&A box. You can put comments in the chat box. And we will also have the opportunity for you to raise your hands and ask questions at appropriate points during the session. So that's pretty much all I'm going to say for the intro. I really want to get on with the conversation. But as we're having a few issues getting Jerry online, I'm going to hand straight over to Peruesh to give us 3 minutes on her perspectives on, what does our world look like after COVID-19? Peruesh, over to you.
Thanks, Rohit. And it's fascinating how we can actually get like almost 400 participants in one conference call. Usually this is so troublesome in real physical reality. One of the things that I'm actually hoping that post-COVID situation where the demand side would increase around anticipatory governance. That's one of the areas that I feel that it will gain momentum. And increasingly, there's going to be significant focus around well-being. What we've seen in the last couple of weeks, how the healthcare systems and how leadership has been in tremendous crisis situation all over the world, where they've only been responding and reacting. Not to say that this is something which is already, we've already discussed this in few of our previous conferences. This is not a black swan event. This was something that had been anticipated enough over the course of decades. So one of the areas that I feel that is going to be hugely important is how societies and how governments organize themselves in moving towards anticipatory governance.
Anything else you want to add to that, Peruesh? You've still got a little bit of time as your opening perspective.
So, you shared the questions like, so we've had 5 questions, and I didn't realize how difficult the question around society values would be. But it's quite challenging because as I meet many people around me who've been actually used to going out for work, their lives have been dramatically been affected. They no longer get to be in a physical reality sort of space where they get to interact with their colleagues or friends or go out on coffees. So I think a lot of that is changing in the sense people are adapting and using newer technologies in order to sort of interact. So there is this human connection which still sort of prevails even in the current crisis. We see Jerry is here.
Thank you, and that's a great time to hand over to Jerry. Jerry, apologies for some video gremlins, but are you ready to share your perspectives, your first 3 minutes on how you see the world after COVID-19 and what you think this global audience that are tuned in should be aware of?
Well, it depends upon the issue of immunity. There's a study that was just done for 147 or so people in Hunan University in China. And the bad news is that 1/3 of the people did not show the antigens of antibodies in their blood, which means that 2/3 have developed immunity, 1/3 didn't, which means the post-first wave is different than we thought just a couple days ago. So we may have to institute serious local, regional, state resilience committees and planning coordinating committees to monitor on a moment-by-moment basis basis for the second thing all over again. We might have a second wave anyway, but the idea would be it would be less of a first wave because of the immunity. Hopefully, by the second wave that helps, but it looks like the vaccines might not be in place. So in any case, the whole idea of taking pandemics as seriously as we take for military war planning seriously has to be changed. And I suspect that the politicians that don't talk in a serious way about this will be put out of office.
And Jerry, you've been doing some very interesting work with the Red Cross on this. Do you want to say anything about some of the key highlights that are coming out of that conversation?
Oh boy. Okay, what we're doing right now is reading our little eyeballs off because studies are being done all around the world, just like the one on Funan I just mentioned. So we're just reading and reading and reading and reading and reading and sharing and looking at the implications. We've created like what we call a characteristics matrix, which is what are those things that will influence what the second wave looks like.
Jerry is frozen, so I'm going to suggest he's back.
All right.
You froze, Jerry, but you're back. Carry on.
Okay, characteristics matrix of scenarios. Those that do these things know that the idea is what are the various factors that got to be in good, bad, middle, mixed scenarios. We're in the process of doing this. We're just collaborating on this now. But these would be just for U.S. We'll take into account the U.S. of the world stuff, but these are just the American Red Cross in the United States.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, let's move on. Let's take Peru. What's your perspective on this?
David, can I have the slide, please?
Yeah, sure. Just a second. I'll give you your slide.
Yeah, we've done a very short and simple scenario analysis, it's about the two major questions. Could you start in presentation mode? It's about two basic questions, which is how bad will it get and how long will it take? And these scenarios, you can download them later. They describe the situation with a virus, medicine, society, politics, states, companies, and world economy. So when we have, could you
Yeah, I can't make it full screen at the moment. I'm sorry, Jerry.
It's just the button down there.
Yeah, I know, but that doesn't actually.
The left of it.
Yeah.
Left of it. Yep. Very good.
Okay.
So now you can click, please. I can. So it's about the two questions I said, and the first one, if you just click through, the first one is the quick recovery, which would mean that the measures are really effective, mostly. That optimism is growing fast. That from May onwards, public and private life is going back to normal in some way, and that we end up with some kind of like 6% downturn in the world economy. So that's the best scenario we can have. Is crash recession. There's no way around the recession, and it's short term. If we see it as a recession and long term, then this will take place when we're not able to develop the vaccine within like the year, the 12 or 18 months as it is promised, that we do not manage to save small business, and then we'll have something like 15% and maybe more downturn in world economy. If we have the crash depression in short term, then we call that the mega crash. And the mega crash is a downturn of up to 67% in the MSCI World Index, which is like, that's the level of 2010. So this would be devastating, really. And this would be politically dangerous because groups of interest would protest. It's going to overthrow governments in many places in the world. And it's going to boost xenophobia and aggression. And if we have the crash depression in the long term, then we call that the system change, which then means we're going to really have a complete reboot of the system. We're going to see new political trends. It's either, these are sub-scenarios, it's either to the left, which would mean universal unconditional basic incomes, maximal taxation of the rich, and so on. Or we would see that to the right, which would then be a very national, a very aggressive, the world would be an arena of countries competing against each other. Or, which we could maybe hope for, is a scenario where a new third way, this will be a government of reason, emerges in most of the countries.
Thank you, Peru.
Just one, wait, there's one click again one time, but important is we need to make our own assumptions and check our own assumptions against that. These are just the extremes.
Thank you, Peru. Okay, let's go straight into Tanya and your perspectives on this.
Okay, thank you, Rohit. Just to mention, I'm sitting at the southern tip of the African continent, in close to Cape Town. To mention that how this is playing out around the world is very, very contextual. So it's playing out very, very differently in many African countries that are kind of lagging in terms of this wave of pandemic and infection. And it's absolutely fascinating to see how it is playing out. So it's very contextual. You know, what counts for Italy and Germany is most certainly not what counts for South Africa. So people do need to be aware of the specific context in which these changes are happening. And speaking of change, I think it's Stuart Brand, I'm not sure, used to speak of sort of layers of change, because Rohit, you asked me to concentrate on consequences. And there are going to be these layers of consequences, fallout, if you want, of what's happening at the moment. So the first one is kind of the consequences of this immediate emergency. And to be honest, personally, I think it's way, way, way too early to start talking about any kind of post-COVID anything, because there's just so much up in the air. And yes, you know, anticipatory governance, yes, Peru scenarios, but this really is a huge, massive change to absolutely everything. So that first layer of getting through change, of getting through this immediate emergency, is to get through, I think, 2 years at least of sort of public health emergency. After that, it's the consequences of the immediate emergency, and that's, you know, to these supply chains, financial markets, supply and demand deeply affected. And then the third layer is sort of this trust and polarization issues, these longer term things that Peru also touched on, and it ranges across from, you know, are we going to see more local self-reliant economies or more globally interdependent economies, decentralized governance and community resilience, or centralized authoritarianism? I mean, more social cohesion and trust, more surveillance. We really don't know at this stage, except to say that a lot of the decisions made now and choices made now are going to shape what comes out of those deeper, further layers of change. And then I have 30 seconds left on my timer, Rohit, just to mention that I think one of the most powerful consequences right now is people are having new experiences, new lived experiences every single day. They can see and experience that things can be done differently. And that leads to believing that things can be done differently. And I think that's one of the most fascinating issues that one could sort of zoom in on. We really all have had a big wake-up call.
Thank you, Tanya. So my turn to share 3 minutes worth of perspective as well. And I think we've already heard a lot about you know, some of the kind of technical changes that are going to happen, the societal challenges. For me, the first thing is that we're going to see some very big winners and losers at the national level. Those countries that have an infrastructure and the capacity to respond, the capacity to borrow, the capacity to invest their way out of this are going to do a lot better than those that were already, you know, considered weak or failing states. And I think this could actually be the catalyst for the merger of certain countries in Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America, and maybe even in Europe, where they decide that actually it's better to pull together their critical arms of government, of infrastructure, of civil society, in order for them to respond in a more coordinated way. We're also going to see the same at industry level. Some are going to do very well. Others, this could well be the beginning of the end of the industry as it's currently structured. And I think we're going to see massive waves of bankruptcies in small businesses around the world where effectively the business has just been put on hold. I think we're going to see some very interesting things happening around how people try and recover from this crisis. So for example, theatres, convention centres, cinemas and others who have a lot of capacity that they only use for a fraction of the time they're open, suddenly starting to think, well, what else can we do with that? And trying to turn themselves into 24/7 facilities and tapping into another thread that we can see happening, which is a lot of businesses who have moved their staff to home working will be asking serious questions about whether they still need to have large offices, large premises for their staff to work from, or whether they can continue with at least part of their staff working from home, which means they need less real estate, which means these other facilities can start to lend themselves out for physical meetings and other kinds of activities. I think one of the other big challenges we face right now is the potential rise of massive poverty across the globe, a massive underclass, permanent unemployment, and a real challenge for a lot of people to actually make their way back out of this. Because alongside what's happening here, we're also seeing a wave of automation that's accelerating, as many businesses are saying they want to reduce their reliance on people in the future. So we know that a lot of the people in process automation, in AI, in all those fields have never been busier, because companies are trying to automate a lot of their processes and almost using this gap in activity to accelerate the innovation process. And the final thing, and on a positive note, I guess, is something that the others have touched on, that this level of community engagement, these self-organizing systems, whether it's using the internet to pull people together to volunteer for civil society roles, whether it's people using the technology and their computing across the globe to do massive multi-parallel research programs looking at vaccines, looking at the causes of COVID-19, looking at how it spreads. We're seeing a lot of that going on. And I think that can only be good for the future of society. And that's my time. We've had 5 really interesting opening perspectives to get us going. We've got some good questions coming in, but I also want to put it out to you now. We have our first polling question. So David, if we could get our first polling question up, and we'll give you all a chance to vote on that. So the first question is, what do you think is the most important action to help bring the current pandemic to an end? And you've got 5 options there. I don't need to read them for you. Let's just take a minute for you to vote. We could have had loads more options, but I just wanted to get 5 slightly different options up there to see where people's energy lies at the moment around this. If you have other thoughts as well about options, the questions we're raising, please do put them in the comments box or throw additional comments into the Q&A section. So David, can we get the results up from the poll, and we'll just get some quick responses from around the panel to see if anyone's got any thoughts on the weightings that come up.
We should be sharing the results now. I don't know whether you guys can see that, but I run through that. We had 13%, 49 people, a population-wide antigen testing, 20% saying...
David, can we get the results on screen so people can see them?
They should be on screen, because I am sharing the results with the with the participants.
We can't see them. Can you just read the responses out and the percentages that go with them? Don't worry about the number of participants. Just
Can you see that now?
No, I can see the first slide in the presentation.
Okay, well, the polling results, let me run through them then. Okay, so population-wide antigen testing, 13%, 43 people. Population-wide antibody testing, 20%. Finding an effective cure, 12%. Development of a COVID-19 vaccine, 39%. And a coordinated global response to managing the situation, 44%.
Wow. So even more people are in favour of the coordinated global response than they are in terms of a vaccine. Do any of the panellists want to share any quick thoughts on what on the results that have just been shared?
I'll go, Rohit. I'm deeply relieved that that came out at 44% and a bit of a majority, because things like antigen testing, antibody testing, cures, vaccines, all tuck in underneath the ability to have a coordinated global response. And that is because we live in a hyper-connected, globalized world. So no country is an island. It's no use having a vaccine going and having it in little patches and not having some kind of global coordinated response where the vaccine goes to most affected parts first, some of it's saved for poor and vulnerable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, it's when that vaccine comes, it's going to have to be worked on collaboratively and together. No country is an island.
Excellent. Should we get one other panelist response to the survey findings?
Well, I agree with that completely. And what I would underline a lot is the idea of decentralized production right now worldwide of the ability to make the vaccine, because you got to set up, even if you don't have the vaccine yet, there's no reason you can't set up your production, massive local decentralized production systems, and you have to fill in those local areas. And I would say that's one of the things that can be done by central stuff. It's interesting because power politics, unfortunately, is raising its head at the moment, because China, as you noticed, did very well in the G20 compared to the United States, was a bit out to lunch. And we got an election coming up, so that may change leadership roles coming up from the United States.
Okay, let's now move to taking some of the audience questions, and we're going to take 5 questions, and I'm going to ask each panelist to respond to one of them. So we're going to stay with you, Jerome, and we've got a question here from David Wood. I don't know if you can see it, but David runs London Futurists, and his question is: since we'll have a better range of options for exit from lockdown, if vaccines or other treatments are accelerated, isn't there an argument for society massively increasing spending on healthcare innovation, e.g. the works done by people like Distributed Bio? Jerome, do you want to take a stab at that one? Is there an argument for massively investing more in healthcare innovation?
Yes, and 3 yeses. One of the things that is being explored by a lot of countries right now, as you know, is the idea of having a gradation of opening up. So it's not you turn a light switch on, as Fauci said, you don't turn a light switch on, everything goes. You may want to have a phased stuff. Those that you've tested, they're resistant. Remember, maybe 1/3 didn't get the resistances in China, as I mentioned before, but you can get that resistance up, and then you sort of phase into the opening up rather than a one-shot opening up.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, we've got a second question here from Christian Schindler, and I'm going to target this one to you, Prawesh. And it says, with current measures deployed across the globe and accepted widely, do you expect a lasting impact on freedom of rights and some more nationalistic approaches, e.g. less globalization? Prawesh, over to you on that one.
I don't think like we've seen how countries had actually locked down their international travel and everything, but at the same time there has been some increase in global cooperation when it comes to medical supplies and when it comes to how do you approach the entire issue. So it is quite soon to sort of assume that we'd have much more nationalistic approaches, and that would greatly curtail the freedoms of different populations. But this is, I think, this entire pandemic situation has brought the global community in a much more cohesive and a much more collaborative manner. And I think if you look at just by the results of that 44%, this is what the expectation also sort of has emerged.
I have a question here that is targeted to you, I guess, Peru, from Dean Bubley. It says, the systems change scenario talks about large-scale taxation of the rich. How does that happen when asset prices, shares, property, etc., all crash? Basically, the former rich will no longer be rich. Are governments going to demand a larger percentage shares of now bankrupt companies? What's the value of them, and who would buy those assets anyway? Peru, what do you think?
Wow, complex question. The system change scenario has 3 sub-scenarios, and only in one of them would it be a rather leftist swing in politics. And then, of course, it would be more egalitarian. People would try to tax the rich more. This will still be more, there will still be rich people. That's not going to go away. Most likely, and assets are not going to be in a deflationary downturn for a long time. This might happen in any scenario, but this is not going to be a constant situation. So you can look into all the countries and all the systems. All of them are trying to make people who are the haves pay for those who are the not haves, so the have nots. So this is not going to be something that is prevented by people by the rich going away in some way.
Excellent. Okay, and we have one now for you, Paresh, and I'm going to tailor Anthony Valley's question. We've got lots of questions coming from men, not many from I've seen so far from women. His question is, do you anticipate any deep changes in society values and behaviors? He said in Western countries, but let's just say globally, e.g. in areas like environmental concerns, sense of community, local production and consumption, health, relationship to money, interaction between humans. Where do you see the biggest changes coming, the biggest deep changes coming in values and behaviors as a result of this? And do you see a split between what might happen in Asia versus in the West? And what's your perspective on this, Paresh?
One of the areas that I've actually been looking at as how much trust has to do with our relationship just amongst one another, but also with public institutions. And I think 4 things that really has really shaped my understanding, like compassion, kindness, generosity, and empathy, perhaps going to be one of few of the leading factors in sort of determining what kind of relationship would we have in the future. And that is perhaps when you look at how the West and Asia looks at itself, you have the Asian community, which are much more relationship oriented. So that's how a lot of Asians sort of operate. Will that change? We've not seen anything sort of changing that sort of cooperation so far, but you can actually sense that trust, freedom, and authenticity is becoming one of the underlying currents of how we view our global economy and what kind of changes sort of we sort of see in the coming future. So this is to say, within the next 5 to 6 years, what are going to be the underpinning relationships, which is going to take a very long, which is going to take the entire civilization a long way.
And I'm going to take the 5th question of this session from Subhash Shukla. Hi, Subhash. Been a long time. Do you see post current crisis some of the Western countries turning less capitalist and more socialist, Also, do you see any change in human behavior that is more caring and perhaps more spiritual? I think we are going to end up with a more socialist model, but we won't be calling it that. You know, we're seeing Spain talking about embracing a guaranteed basic income. Canada's effectively doing one for 4 months. We're seeing a need to invest more in health services. We're seeing more community activity. I think we will see an element of that. But once we get out of this, I can't help thinking that there'll also be a massive dash for cash and a very rapid push to drive growth, maybe at the cost of some of the civil society elements. And a couple of the things that I think we're going to see as unintended byproducts of this is we're going to become a much more litigious society. Whether it's landlords and their tenants arguing over rent, whether it's suppliers and their customers arguing over cancelled contracts, hotel and event owners arguing about cancelled events, but also a lot of individuals taking their healthcare systems to court over what they consider to be inappropriate treatment of their family members. At the moment, everyone's calling the health service heroes, but I think afterwards there'll be a search for retribution. We already know there are several $1 billion of claims in most countries. And the other side of that is that, you know, talking to my daughter who's just become a medic, she's aware that there's a growing sense that a lot of medics, whilst they're toughing it through right now, they're expecting to turn to the courts to take on governments that they feel didn't provide the necessary protective equipment and testing. So I think we're also going to see that emerge, and we'll see this mix of the two, the more spiritual, more caring, but also a harder, more money-focused, more litigious society emerging in parallel. Okay, so let's take the next polling question if we can, David.
Okay. So the polling is now live. I do apologise to the panelists that I didn't click on the button that allows panelists to vote.
We can't see the poll yet, David.
No, the attendees are viewing the poll. It says we are getting responses in. So I apologise that I didn't tick on the box that allows panelists to vote. So
You've got a lot of comments coming through saying the attendees can't see.
Well, it tells me that the attendees are now viewing and some people are voting. So I think that may be a Zoom problem.
Okay. In fact, chat is maxed out on the number of people.
Yeah, I can see. I do apologise for that, but the polling is launched. Somebody has answered. Okay, I'll end that and I'll try and launch it again. If you just bear with me a second, and I'll relaunch that poll. And I'll allow the panelists to vote this time. So
there you go.
Okay, so the polling has been relaunched. And it says attendees are now viewing the questions. Are we getting responses in now?
Excellent.
Can you see that on your screen now, Rohit?
Yeah, that was there.
Yeah.
Can I just ask the people attending the event to keep the Q&A section purely for questions, and then any comments put into the chat section? And inevitably, we only had 5 options, so some of you may not agree, but we just wanted to go with 5 options. We just wanted to go with 1.
So we got 51% voted so far.
Okay, let's
get
the
poll.
Yeah, share the results. And apologies to anyone who feels like their question wasn't there, their option wasn't there. Oh, we've got the results on screen as well. So an interesting balance in favour of small businesses and universal basic incomes. I don't know whether it reflects the nature of who's joined the webinar, but there really isn't that belief that the money that's currently being pulled into the financial services sector is being placed in the right places. Let's have Peruesh and Perot just respond to what you've seen on screen there. What's your response to those two, to that polling question and the answers?
I'm not really as surprised, because if I just take Pakistan for as an example of as to what's happening, the government has some form of income doling out to the people below or right around the poverty line. This is something happening, but they're also along the same line planning to do something with the small, medium scale business owners. So you have a lot of people who are not going to work because of the lockdown situation. And they do have a time frame in mind as to when this whole situation will be brought to whatever the new normal or the normal may look like. But they're still not convinced as to how far they can stretch this out. So given the two situation, it is very important to understand the entrepreneurship, the startup landscape, and the kind of demographic that we are sort of dealing with that would require some form of government assistance at one point in time.
Excellent, excellent. Perot, what about you?
I agree pretty much with what the poll said. The financial services, the banks are not at the core of this crisis. They might be in a later phase because of businesses failing, but the financial sector, that's different compared to 2008. Small business makes an economy more robust, which is very helpful. Universal basic income, if it's unconditional, I doubt it will work. If there is a kind of a conditional basic income, this will be necessary, and not just because of the crisis, but also because of technological progress. Accelerated investment in greener industries is okay, is good, but this is just one sector. It's maybe the best sector, but it's not really connected to this crisis. So the major employers, well, yeah, I would invest more in the small business because it's more sustainable.
Okay, fantastic. We're now going to go back to those 5 kind of headline questions that we had in the design of this, and each of us is going to take one question. So I'm going to start us off with the question of how might the global economy and regional markets be reshaped? And I touched on this some of this earlier. I think one of the most interesting things we're going to see is the big institutional investors like pension funds and sovereign wealth funds starting to change the focus of where they've invested. They've traditionally been quite hesitant to do anything but publicly listed equities, bonds, that kind of thing. But I think you'll see them moving more and more now to green technologies, and if you like, lockdown resilient investments. So what are those sectors that are likely to stay open when an economy shuts down? Because they're all becoming aware that this is likely to happen again. So you could see more going into things like infrastructure investment, green technologies, information technology, when they have all been, well, the majority have been somewhat hesitant to go there. I think the second thing we're going to see is this shift by a lot of corporations towards much more localized manufacturing, to be able to have a footprint in more places, to start to change supply chains, that some will move away from centralized manufacturing and global distribution towards much more localized manufacture that can potentially survive more in a turbulent environment. And I think one of the other things we're going to see is more and more companies trying to digitally reinvent themselves, so that rather than having physical products, they'll start to sell the patents and the right to use their ideas and their IP and delivering that globally, allowing local manufacturers to actually produce and deliver that. so that they can stay operating even when the shutters start to come down. And one final thing that I see happening here, and we already see it happening, is inevitably, I think the technology sector is going to become an even bigger winner out of this because of the growing reliance of on tech to help businesses and individuals through. And we're using tech now to deliver something that would previously have been a purely physical experience most of the time. I'm going to move on now, move to our second question, which was around the operating environment. And the question here is, are we looking at a complete reboot of the system or more gradual change? And Peru is going to pick this one up for us.
Yeah, we're going to see both. This is really a shock. So there's no way just to return to normal. We're never going back to normal again. And as you said, technology will be a real factor, not only in our communication and our way to work, but also with genetic engineering and genetic editing with CRISPR. So is it going to be a real reboot? I would fear a real reboot. We have an equilibrium of habits, of values. So we're not going to change the world very fast. But the shock is big enough to make us rethink what's really important, to make us place corporate social value in the center of what we do in business and in politics. So yeah, it's neither nor. It's not just rebooting, and it's not a complete change of the system that I would expect.
Great. Tanya, we've got the next topic for you, which is around consequences. Who do you feel might be the biggest beneficiaries and victims of the crisis?
Super interesting one. And there's a kind of a knee-jerk answer to this, which is some of the biggest losers are going to be the poor and the vulnerable. You know, people that in this immediate crisis don't have access to healthcare systems, won't have fast access to a vaccine as and when it comes, etc. So they're definitely kind of winners and losers in the mix there. But if one looks at this slightly in a more nuanced way, Rohit, I feel very strongly that the people or institutions or organizations or countries, companies that come out of this base are going to be those that are resilient. And resilience has become quite a buzzword or a fuzzword. But if one sort of really zooms in on what does resilience mean in terms of the capacity to deal with change. And that's got different aspects. The first really is your capacity to deal with change means you can recover, you can persist, you can go back to some, in the new normal, you can go back to some kind of normal that worked for you, whoever you are, you know, sort of fairly resilient. And then you might be okay navigating then. Then there's the adaptation thing. You can adapt. But the one that's really interesting, resilience also means you or the organization or the country can innovate and transform. And that's the truly interesting area where I think winners are going to emerge from, you know, coming out of the consequences of this, is where can the innovation and transformation happen, regardless of what your unit of analysis is, whether it's personal, organizational, institutional. And just to end off by saying, and I don't mean this glibly, what's really interesting is sometimes the most resilient sectors or people are those that have not been as entrenched in old ways of doing things. And interestingly, a lot of that is on the African continent and in Asia. You know, we're not as sort of stuck and bought in and deeply embedded in old ways of doing things. So it's a little easier to innovate, to transform, to do things differently. So we might be seeing some interesting, unexpected winners in some unexpected places. You know, that thing of innovation truly does come from the messy edges. So I would, if you're keeping an eye on the future, watch the messy edges.
while we're on the subject of Africa, I'm going to ask you a question that Amina Mansari has raised, which is, so far Africa is not so badly hit by COVID-19, but it's been speculated that it will be greatly hit by economic hardship. How well do you see Africa moving ahead in some of their challenges, or I guess African countries moving ahead?
I say it depends greatly to what extent there is some kind of coordinated, collaborative response globally. So we've already seen calls for the world to, to look at some, make some financing available, or to help out with debt relief, etc., etc. So a lot of it will depend on that. But, and this is a big but, I mean, right now already we're seeing capital flight on steroids. So any kind of investment money that was and has been invested in the continent is fleeing. Most of the African economies are quite primary extraction, resource-based economies. So places like Nigeria, Angola, because we've had this oil price crash as well, is going to take a very, very long time to recover. Interestingly, South Africa is an interesting case. It's a little more different. We're seeing an absolute ramp up in localized production because of this crisis. But don't ever forget that Africa's biggest trading partner and international friend is China. So, international relations, and this is all, it's going to unfold over years. This whole thing about the effects and consequences of the 2008 financial crash are still with us while we're living through this. This thing's going to unfold over years and years, but it'll be truly interesting.
Thank you. And you're getting a lot of support in the comments box about this as well with your perspectives. Let's move on now to Paresh. And you agreed to take this topic, which is society. How might values and behaviors evolve? And I guess, it'd be very interesting to get your perspective from Pakistan in particular and from your part of the world.
So just to talk about the Pakistani context alone, the society has come through in terms of reaching out to the most needy. So
can you activate your video as well? Thanks.
Wait. Can you see it? Okay, great. So from just the Pakistani perspective, we've actually seen the society, the civil society, the not-for-profit sector also coming together in terms of reaching out to the most needy in the society. But picking up from what you had mentioned earlier, actually, how is this sort of scaling, at least in the country, is by the use of technology. So technology is a clear winner in all of this. What I would sort of hope is, like, if you were to just freeze 2020 and move on to 2021, I think 2021 early on, we would actually realize what have we learned from the current crisis? How did the leadership from all across the world respond to these crises, and what sort of new behaviors would emerge? So there would be greater trust as to what the technology has to offer. And I think the current crisis actually is a huge indication of it, just alone, how we're connecting, how we connect with our families, how we connect with our friends, but also at the same time, how we are sort of reaching out to the ones actually are in need. So it's a great enabler in terms of doing a lot of good work, at least here in Pakistan. And I'm sure it's happening in most countries at the same time. But how effectively would governments use the same? This is something I think in about 2 to 3 months, we would, once we start getting the result, we would see how technology has helped governments sort of deliver public goods.
You're muted, Rohit.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. Paresh, while we're on the subject of society, I'm going to pose you a question that's come in from Kapil Gupta, which says, is there a possible scenario where people are recognizing that during this period they are enjoying being as opposed to defining our lives and self-worth by doing, beyond just thinking about it from an economic perspective? So is there something valuable happening here around and the being versus doing debate?
That is a fantastic question. I mean, I would give you my personal example. I'm actually in a weird way. I'm kind of appreciating this whole what is happening and what I'm learning in the process, which basically means I am sort of building a much more greater regard for the relationships that I have. And there's more value in those relationships that I tend to find more than anything. I mean, you call it the economy, the material and the aspect where the investment sort of goes in. But I feel the human connection there is something that is truly valuable. It is something that I'm getting to learn as an individual. And I know that there are friends here in Pakistan and elsewhere in the world are getting to learn the same thing. But how much of that is reflective in the leadership discourse? I think that's something which is still sort of missing.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, and Jerry, you're going to take the fifth of our opening points, which is around action. What should leaders, politicians, and individuals be doing now to prepare themselves for what's clearly been identified as such an uncertain future?
I wanted to just add on to Prawesh just a second before I answer that. All of us know that have children, that especially if there's 2 or 3 children, that sometimes you want to say, time out, stop, you know? One could argue that civilization and humans and culture is not necessarily working as best as it ought to for a variety of reasons. So maybe it's a nice idea that we're having a timeout. It's a horrible price to pay for it, but the idea of this is the first time that human species has had a timeout together. I just want to underline the potentials of that on the relations and this concept of being as being doing. Now, on what leaders should do, as I started to say in the very beginning, one is that each political head should have a pandemic security unit in the same way that it's got a national security advisor, meaning usually military, but we also got to do in parallel with the biological one, which is biological terrorism, by the way, because it overlaps. This is a dress rehearsal for what a nation should do if they have biological terrorism, by the way. So that's one. Then that should cascade down all the way to local communities. Local communities, we can call them resilience communities. I would add on the concept of resilience. Resilience as applied to biology means, as Taja said, it's response and adaptation to a crisis or a disaster. With humans, I would add another element to what resilience means. It means anticipation and planning. You know, the average squirrel does not anticipate and plan necessarily, although they put nuts in the ground and things like that. But that's a cyclical thing. But we have to include foresight as a normal function of resilience, which we don't necessarily yet. So we've got to have these local resilience communities going all the way up. You know, if we get locked down again, what do we do about food? How do we handle all that sort of stuff? So political leaders have got to begin to take biology as seriously as we have taken military kinetic planning and so forth in a parallel, which was pointed out very nicely by Bill Gates some years ago.
Excellent. Okay, we've got a couple more polling questions, but we've got some really interesting questions coming in from the audience. We've got one here from Joe Buckeye, and I'm just going to throw it open to whichever you wants to answer it. He says this could be a touchy subject, but is this situation, the outcomes and the lessons we've learned, going to be a major setback for libertarianism? Who'd like to have a stab at that one? Gary, do you want to have a go at that?
If I may, there's a reason why in system change, one sub-scenario is a very right-wing libertarian political swing, because there is there is a large proportion of people that I watch and read and talk to, at least here in Europe, that would see a very an increase in resilience with a more libertarian approach to politics. I'm not advocating it, but this is a very, very realistic outcome of system change.
Yeah, add on to that, there is an undercurrent of people saying, stop this globalization, get rid of all that sort of stuff, take care of your own thing. First, yeah, there is that undercurrent, increased internationalism and increase local, non-internationalism as well. One of the things I've learned in futures research over 45 years is that when you look at something, and then later on you see what happens, it turns out to be more complex than you think was possible. So my thought on this was you'll have both at the same time. You'll have both increased collaboration, increase internationalization, increase UN sort of stuff, et cetera, at the same time increase, like, leave me alone, internal and looking inside. Probably both will happen at the same time.
Excellent. I'm going to throw open this question to Prawesh as it sort of relates to what you said, but Tanya, please come in on this as well. It's from Marie-Hélène Calliol, and it says, in relation to what Prawesh just said, what are the post-COVID world's educational challenges, e.g. challenges we already sense, but which the crisis reveals more clearly? Do both of you want to have a say on that?
I would just give you like a brief example with what the Higher Education Commission in Pakistan is trying to, the regulatory authority is trying to do with over 200 universities, issued a notice that how each of those universities has to move on to a learning management system, realizing very quickly that there is a digital gap between not just amongst different universities, but between the regulator and the universities. So one of the, I think the regulators are getting to learn more from this, how this pandemic has actually hit and what the impact has led them to. But I would sort of also sort of assume that you'd have much more academic literature as a result of what is going on also emerge. And that should help the governments and the corporate sector to sort of have a much more, much more discussion around how do you anticipate and what is the foresight that is required in order to create that mechanism for resilience, which can be adapted at an institutional level. Having said that, so there are universities that are uploading their lectures, the faculty is uploading their lectures, there are exams which are happening, but not to the extent that which one would assume that there is an equal sort of technology spread all across. So there are some sort of lapses which are there. And I think the government is beginning to understand how those lapses may impact any sector, be it the education, be it the health sector we've seen already. So yeah, it becomes a very cross-cutting issue altogether.
Just very quickly from my side, agree absolutely with everything Prawesh is saying, and I think some aspects of the education sector are going to fundamentally change forever. A lot of it has to do with technology, but a lot of it also is, and it's complex, is figuring out really how to deal with the technology inequity. Again, I live somewhere, I work at a university as well. There are some students that do not own a laptop. So again, amazingly interesting time for opportunities to grapple with things that we should have technically grappled with a long time ago. And just to end off by saying, I think extreme need right now to teach futures literacy. And there are many sort of initiatives around the world to promote that, to teach the future, teach futures literacy. so that everybody and each institution gets just a hell of a lot better at learning about foresight, learning how to deal with uncertainty, as a capacity, as a freedom, as a choice to be able to know, how do I use my view of the future or a view of the future to take better decisions and make better choices in the present. I think education and that is truly deeply important.
I definitely agree with you on that last point. One of the things I would say on the education front is that it is highlighting the need, in a sense, to get technology into the hands of every child as a benefit to them. But I think it's also driving the digital literacy of teachers around the world who maybe have resisted for several years bringing more tech into the teaching experience. It's also forcing them to learn how to be more creative and more engaging with their students when they're trying to keep 30 kids or 20 kids together on, in a Zoom class. And I'm hoping that when they go back into the physical classroom, they'll learn how to blend physical with digital and make the physical experience more interesting and entertaining. So we've got a few minutes left. We've got a couple more poll questions. David, can we get the third poll question up, just to kind of get a view from people as to what we think about this one? So based on what you've heard, what you've been thinking so far, I mean, we've all been living this crisis at pretty much the same level. Of kind of level of focus and thinking around it. What do we see as the biggest single priority for businesses and governments to help navigate the future? And again, we could have had 120 different options here. We just picked 5 just to get some juices going. So let's just take a minute for people to vote. Let's take a second or two. We'd also really welcome feedback. So if you've got any feedback on how this ran, apologies for the tech issues. It's the first time we're doing it. We didn't quite expect to have 760 odd people sign up for it. But it's been a fantastic, fun experience. But if you've got any comments about how it's been run, how you do it better in the future, please jot them down in the comments box. We'd welcome any thoughts on that, or throw them in the questions box if the comments box is full. David, can we get the results up of that poll?
Yeah. I'm sharing the results now. Can you see them okay?
Well, I wonder if the first one is the fact that there's quite a few futurists on this.
Yeah, I was going to say that's not really a fair poll.
But then I'm just hoping that everyone's just really enlightened. But yeah, interesting that societal wellbeing's come up. Someone asked whether we'll share the results. Yeah, what we'll do is we will consolidate, when I say we, probably me, we'll consolidate all the chat comments, the questions, and somehow turn it into a document that we can share so people can have a look at them afterwards. Because we've had 98 questions and we probably answered about 12 of them. So conscious of that. Let's get the final question up, which is really just a bit of fun to get a sense of, what value you place on this kind of thing. So if we were to charge for this kind of thing, would you, what would you be willing to pay? Would you buy me a coffee? Would you buy us a croissant too? Would dinner be on you? Would it be drinks all round, or would you lavish us with riches? Or do you just think this should all be done for free? All are equally valid options, but let's just give people a minute or so to vote.
Rohit, you realize, of course, that $1 equals about 20 Rand these days. Anybody living in an emerging country, currency is having a little, there's a little bit of a forex issue.
I just reverted to the kind of reserve global currency rather than trying to have one that covered 210 nations.
Tanya, we'll just convert it into whatever our currency means in that context.
Yeah. No, I'm just pulling his leg. It was fine, the price of a coffee or a pizza works for me.
Well, that's why I gave you the other option as well. So all right. Can we get the results up on screen? Okay, that's about half of the people went with the option I went with, actually, which is that these should be free. But you know, it's nice to know that there's a few of you willing to pay, and hopefully 2 of my friends offering to lavish me with riches. Excellent. Well, thank you for those. That's really helpful. We promised to finish this on time. I have been on webinars that lasted 2 hours and were meant to be an hour. So I think it's really important that we stick to time. We just got a few closing thoughts. I want to firstly thank David and John for Myoma, for John Andrews and David Wortley for doing all the technical support for this, managing everything. We've learned a huge amount in the process of setting this first one up. We promise we'll get marginally better each time. Secondly, I'd love to thank all our panelists for sharing their thoughts and engaging so freely with their expertise. And finally, and most importantly, I'd love to thank everyone who signed up and participated. And we just got a couple of closing slides to share with you, just to tell you what's going on next. And if you can share your thoughts in the comments box, that'd be fantastic. David, can we get the final 3 slides up? We'll start with that one then. Just to say thank you, a 48-hour offer. If some of you already receive our Futurescapes newsletter, it's normally 149, but if you want to, just take a picture of this screen and you can get it for free. And also we're offering all the books in our bookstore at a 20% discount. Actually, it's 25%. I don't know why it says 20 there. And that one called Opportunity to the Edge is actually free. So if you grab a picture of that screen, if you're interested. And then let's go to the next screen. If we could, David.
Yeah, I've got to load this one this way.
Just keep, okay. This next one is way more important. So we are also doing a book by the same name as this series called Aftershocks and Opportunities, Scenarios for a Post-Pandemic Future. And we have a call for chapters out at the moment. We have some fantastic chapters in from around the world already. The closing date, hopefully you can all see that. The closing date for that is to get your submissions in at April the 19th so that we can get it published on June the 1st. There's a website link there. If you didn't see the website link, we'll send it out afterwards. Can we get that slide back up, David?
Yeah, I'm sorry that it's because PowerPoint has defaulted to the last slide, so that's why I couldn't go back. But
okay,
hopefully people can see the call for chapters. Can they now?
Yeah, and then yeah, these are in the wrong order. But then can we go to slide 3 then on our next webinar?
Okay.
And finally, just to say we've got another webinar coming up next week, same time, looking at visions of a post-pandemic society. So focusing much more on societal issues, going into more detail on things like universal basic income, values, beliefs and behaviors. We're lining up and different generational perspectives. And again, we're lining up a really interesting global gender balance panel to share their thoughts with you. And thank you very much for attending and sharing with us. And we will come back to you with the link to sign up. The Zoom link for that next webinar will go live in the next day or so. We'll share that with you. And we'll come back to you also with a summary of all the comments in the chat and the Q&A so that if people want to follow up those discussions, they can. Thank you all again. It's 3:15 here in London. No idea what time it is where you are in the world, but thank you all. Have a fabulous holiday weekend if you're having one. If not, just carry on having another 2 months of Sundays. Bye now.